You are now listening to the Paul McGUIRE Report. Wherever you are on planet Earth, wherever you are in the USA, welcome to the Paul McGUIRE Report. Today's program, prophetic analysis of current events and talking to you about stuff that you will not hear or see at all in the mainstream media, and talking about stuff that never seems to make it in the alternative media. There's certain categories of truth that if you talk about it, it's too potent, it's too spiritual. I mean, it's okay. You can talk about all kinds of spirituality, but if you talk in depth about biblical spirituality, somehow, some way, the predominant social media leaders, if you will, won't do it that way. They won't talk about it. Well, we will, but we'll also talk about the other stuff. It's in the combination. It's in the analysis of current events and other events that we can discover the truth. So let's get into it. Venezuela, we talked about it the other day. We're going to talk about it again, but we're going to talk about it in a way that integrates what is happening in Venezuela with global geopolitical events, prophecy, and other stuff that I'm not sure is adequately discussed in most places. In any case, we need to know it, because when you know the truth sets you free. Okay, so back in Venezuela, the critics of Trump, and this is not supposed to be like rah Trump, throw out our brains. That's not the purpose of the program. But at the same time, it would be disingenuous not to discuss the facts in light of what President Trump did that helped the situation. Because when you listen to the mainstream media, the guy is demonized, and everything that he does is attacked or undermined. And for the sake of having integrity, that's all this is about, attempting to have integrity, it's important to present the truth. So the mainstream media, the left media, the socialist media, is hammering away at Trump, saying that this invasion and the capture of Maduro, the dictator of Venezuela, that this was all, MAGA delusion stuff, the president's ego. Well, that's not what it was about. That's not what it was about at all. This was done primarily as a military action to dismantle a military threat, a huge military threat in our southern hemisphere. So, for example, when you have a nation like Venezuela, which, by the way, I said on the previous program that Venezuela either had the number 1 or number 2 oil reserves in the entire world. That's a lot. Well, they have the number 1 oil reserves in the entire world. So they have more barrels of oil potentially than any other nation on planet Earth. So if a hostile global environment were to occur, like World War III, or a military confrontation between America and other nations over who knows what, oil is a strategic reserve. And a nation that owns and controls all the oil has a definite military advantage. So, what was the purpose of attacking Venezuela? Well, there was a multitude of purposes, but one of them was geopolitical. You can't just ignore that, because if you wanted to bring America to its knees, you would attack America or any other nation at its most critical points. And that includes energy reserves and energy. Okay, so what we know about Venezuela is that the Venezuelan dictator, and he is a dictator. That's not mythological. Nobody's making that stuff up. He's a dictator. And we know that Maduro was a dictator. And he's a communist, Marxist, socialist dictator. And his predecessor, Hugo Chavez, was a communist dictator, like the Cuban regime and the other communist regimes around the country. And so, when we look at Maduro, he took away the freedoms of the Venezuelan people. He used the money that they could have used to produce food and buy food. The people in Venezuela are going hungry, and in some cases are starving. So this is not a regime that's helping its own people. It has attacked its own people. And in addition to that, Venezuela, now this is the important thing, Venezuela is not acting as a solitary nation. Venezuela is not conducting these militant and hostile actions against the United States. It was a relatively short period of time before Maduro was apprehended and brought to the United States. He was on social media going ballistic and attacking President Trump and accusing President Trump and threatening the United States and threatening President Trump with very terrible things. Now, the response was not a ego response on behalf of the president. When you have a man talking that crazy in that crazy of a manner, threatening the United States, threatening its president, you got to take that threat seriously, because that man is liable to do anything. So he was, and now he's not at the present moment, a clear and present danger to the United States of America. Okay, so let's look at Venezuela. Venezuela has currently 303 billion barrels of oil. That's a lot of oil. They have oil reserves that are the top level of oil reserves on planet Earth, which, when you translate the value of all the oil barrels that they control, it amounts to $17 trillion, in excess of $17 trillion of oil reserves. That's a lot of oil. And here's where we examine the situation geopolitically. Iran, which is no friend to the United States of America. And by the way, why were previous administrations flying on military jets, massive plates, like giant plates that they would have in a giant retail store? They have a crane-like device, and they move these pallets, these giant wooden pallets, to move like refrigerators around and stuff like that. Well, our government used military jets to fly in an enormous number of wooden pallets that were stacked high with cash money, $100 denominational American US dollars were shipped into Iran. Why did we pay them in cash? Because we don't want the money tracked or traced. So we were propping up a regime which is in open hostility to the United States of America. Why would you do that unless you had a hidden agenda to destabilize America or to destroy America? So, why is it that the enemies of the United States of America, like Communist China is they have a lot of oil. Communist China is an oil-dependent nation. In order for Communist China to expand its economy, to grow its economy, in order for Communist China to continue to be a vibrant nation, a vibrant and powerful nation, Communist China must have a regular infusion of oil from nations like Venezuela. Venezuela and Communist China have a very cozy relationship. And Communist China buys from Venezuela 60 to 90% of the oil that Communist China uses. 60% to 90% of the oil that Communist China uses comes directly from Venezuela. And in addition to that, Communist China has a tremendous need for oil. So they have to buy additional oil from nations like Iran. So Communist China not only buys enormous amounts of oil from Venezuela, but Communist China buys enormous amounts of oil from Iran, Iranian oil. And Communist China buys 85 to 90% of the, if you combine the oil that Communist China gets from Iran, and if you combine the oil that Communist China buys from Venezuela, that means the total amount of oil that Communist China imports from both Iran and Venezuela is somewhere between 85 to 90% on a regular basis. So 85 to 90% of the oil that Communist China uses comes from its cozy relationship with Iran and Venezuela. So, that's a huge percentage of Communist China's oil. I think it amounts to Communist China, 70% of Communist China's total oil comes from its transactions with nations like Iran and Venezuela. So, what does this do geopolitically? Well, if instead of looking at it in the false light of trying to denigrate Trump as having to have his ego stroked, what are the real geopolitical benefits to America invading with 150 airships, America invading Venezuela? Well, the beneficial fallouts are things like, remember, Communist China has been talking about for a long time Communist China has been threatening to invade Taiwan. And as you know, Taiwan is still relatively free. Taiwan is one of the most prosperous nations in the world. Compared to the other Chinese areas, Taiwan is a jewel, a global jewel. So with this recent American invasion, which took out Maduro and is allowing for Venezuela to be set free from this iron grip of Marxist dictatorships, this threatens Communist China's very ambitious plans to invade and repossess Taiwan. Remember, they signed Taiwan and Communist China signed a contract a long time ago, which gives Communist China the legal right to control Taiwan. And at a certain date, which I believe it's already expired, the due date, according to the contract that Taiwan signed with Communist China has a legal right to take back Taiwan into its fold, to take back the control of Taiwan. Now, because Communist China's oil infusion from Iran and Venezuela, but primarily at this point, it's mainly Iran, with Communist China's dependence on Venezuelan oil and Iranian oil, that threatens any military adventures they may have in taking back forcefully control over Taiwan. In other words, the fear of being invaded by the fear of being invaded by Communist China, Taiwan has always been in terror of that. And now that the Communist China infusion of oil coming from Venezuela and then eventually Taiwan is up for grabs, there appears to be a very significant reluctance by Communist China to actually begin invading Taiwan as they have threatened. So this action provides geopolitical stability, and which helps the United States of America, by the way, enormously. And in addition to that, Communist China has long planned to be the global leader in AI technology, and Communist China has ambitions to be the global leader in AI production and AI technology. Now that their oil supply is in jeopardy, this in turn jeopardizes any Communist Chinese plans for a Taiwan invasion. It jeopardizes any Communist Chinese plan at global total AI dominance. It threatens Communist China's plan to overthrow the dollar as a global currency and install the Communist China-backed, Russia-backed BRICS competition as a global currency or reserve currency. So there's a lot going on in Venezuela. Venezuela is not just some obscure South American nation. Venezuela is one of the most powerful economic nations on earth. And Communist China knows that. America knows that too, obviously. So there is a mysterious little island off the coast of Venezuela. And it's not the island you might think of. You know, the song, I think it's by Jimmy Buffett, Margaritaville. Well, there kind of exists a Margaritaville off the coast of Venezuela. And this Margaritaville is called Margarita Island. And Margarita Island is it's small, it's almost never talked about in the media, but Margarita Island, that's off Venezuela, is the hidden place where Communist China, Russia, and Iran send in high-level special ops type soldiers to train Venezuelan soldiers, to train Venezuelan citizens that have been drafted. I don't think they have a formal draft. I think it's you get a notification, show up and kiss your family goodbye style stuff. I'm not laughing because it's tragic, so forgive me for whatever laughter I expressed there. They just don't have any freedom. And this Margarita Island is a secretive, clandestine island where high-level military trainers from Communist China, Russia, and Iran, the same people, by the way, that are training the ISIS terrorist cells in Iran. Iran, remember, never forget, Iran has been for decades and continues to be to this very day. Iran is the world's #1 leading exporter and creator and generator of terrorist cells, specifically now the ISIS terrorist cells. And so ISIS, high-level ISIS trainers are part of this mix of trainers that go into Margarita Island and train the soldiers of Venezuela. Now, where do you think, do the math with me. So Venezuela hates the United States. Maduro is openly boasting of taking down the United States and decimating the United States. And he has a lot of money from the oil reserves to do a lot of that. So on Margarita Island, off the coast of Venezuela, you have Russian agents, military trainers, Iranian military trainers, and Iranian ISIS military trainers. And I think, as I said, Venezuelan military trainers. So where do you think that these military trainers go after they're trained? Well, probably a certain amount of them go back into Venezuela so they can continue to clamp down on any uprising that might occur inside domestic Venezuela. But where else might these newly trained special ops and newly trained soldiers go? Now, after all, it's very revealing by what nations or what groups are sponsoring this clandestine terrorist training on the island of Margarita. Yeah, you have Russia, you have China. They're very good at this kind of thing. But you also have Iranian military trainers, and the same Iranian military trainers that are responsible for terrorist organizations sponsored by Iran, like Hezbollah. Hezbollah, a known terrorist group, is on. Hezbollah operatives are on the island of Margarita, and it's the Hezbollah terrorist operatives that are training Venezuelan soldiers and Venezuelan recruits. Well, what do you think they're training them in? Well, let's do the math. If one of the primary training groups or categories is Hezbollah, a known terrorist organization, then it would be logical to assume that the style of warfare, the style of military training that the Venezuelan soldiers are receiving and that the recruits from Venezuela are receiving, it's pretty obvious that they are being trained in how to be a terrorist. You don't send in terrorist cells to train, like Hezbollah, to train people on a remote island off of Venezuela unless you had a specific plan to train them to train them to operate, to train them to function like Hezbollah, which is a terrorist cell organization that spreads terror all over the Middle East. So, let me do the math for you, but you've probably already done it. The secret clandestine training going on in the island of Margarita in significant parts is they're sending in Hezbollah terrorist cell operatives to train people in Venezuela. So where would they go after they were trained by Hezbollah on Margarita Island? Well, since one of the biggest enemies, according to Maduro, the dictator, the head of Venezuela, is America, it's only logical to assume that it may very well be possible that these Hezbollah-trained Venezuelan terrorists would be sent to places like America. Wake up and smell the coffee, America. Wake up and smell the coffee, America. Israel, the Middle East, and other flashpoints and other strategic objectives of Venezuela. So, again, let's do the math together. This becomes an existential threat to America. By existential threat, I mean America's very right to existence is seriously compromised and threatened if the existence of Hezbollah-trained terrorist cells that were manned by soldiers from Venezuela end up burrowing into the United States of America. What would that look like? It would look like you would have a series of terrorist events erupting all across America. The media would most likely try to hide the true nature of these events. It could be anything from shooting kids in open school, terrorist acts, detonating dirty bombs, which are nuclear particles inside conventional bombs, detonating radiological bombs, dispersing biological agents, biological warfare agents, chemical agents, shooting, hijacking, causing unrest, killing the power in major cities. I mean, the list of prospective terrorist targets is endless. So if you see waves of these and I've been talking about this, remember? I've been talking to you about this in an intensified manner for probably a year and a half now. I've been dropping the seeds of this information into the audience very subtly over the last year and a half. I've been talking to you about the possibility of increased terrorist activity in America. And those of you that listen on a regular basis know exactly what I'm talking about. So here we are, as I've been warning you about it, and now we have substantive information that reveals to us the actual mechanism by which this might happen. And that means that these Hezbollah terrorist operatives, sponsored by Iran, setting up camp on Margarita Island off the coast of Venezuela, where are they? They're being trained in a terrorist-style military action. Where would they go? Well, they would go to any flashpoint or hot point that was considered an objective for Venezuela or Iran or Communist China or whoever. But that would include, obviously, targeting the United States of America. So now, do the math with me again on a deeper level. If you follow the money flowing out of Communist China, if you follow the money flowing out of Iran, if you follow the money flowing out of Russia, how does this money flow from those three nations? The money flows from these three nations via massive oil purchases from Communist China, from Communist Russia, from Iran, and Iran is working in conjunction with Hezbollah. So the money that's flowing out of Iran, flowing out of China, flowing out of Russia, ends up, to a significant degree, financing. This money begins to flow in to Hezbollah, and it also helps to finance the terrorist training camps on Margarita Island and other places. So do you see how this works? This is a multi-leveled, multi-tiered offensive attack against the United States of America. And this is a huge threat, and it's never talked about. Do you hear the Hollywood actors ever talk about this? Never. They don't know about it. They only listen or watch stuff that agrees with them. So I'm giving you this information so you can be aware of the multidimensional nature of the reality that we live in, and so that you can understand the hidden agenda that is embedded in the other so-called agendas. So, what does this mean? Well, it means that Iran, along with Hezbollah, they are sending terrorist trainers, recruiting soldiers from Venezuela, and they've been moving into South America for a long time. They were moving into South America via the oil money being sold to those major nations via Hugo Chavez before Maduro took over. They've been financing this flow of terrorists and assembling of terrorist cells across South America. And I'm not Johnny come lately, I didn't just discover this over the weekend or something. So what does this mean? We're going to be back in a moment, and I'm going to share with you information that I spread far and wide about who was financing what terror cells as far back as 2005. You see, a lot of these people in conservative social media, alternative media, they mean well, but their research and their understanding is extremely shallow because they've only been enlightened, so to speak, in quotes. They've only been enlightened. They've only come to the light. They've only begun to understand all this stuff, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, maybe 4 years ago. But most of them just saw the light in terms of understanding 2 to 3 years ago. This is by their own words. So they don't, even though they may mean well, they don't really know what they're talking about. And then when you have lots of Christians who equally have a shallow understanding about a lot of things, they're going to people who also have a shallow understanding. Well, I'm happy for the fact that they're getting some understanding. But in order to reverse the effects of drinking the Kool-Aid, you're going to need a mega dose of truth. So when you go back to 2005, I wrote a book that went into great detail exposing the nature of the terrorist threat to America, the nature of the South American terrorist threat to America, and all the hidden chambers and doors and mysterious alliances of a multiplicity of nations. So we're going to talk about what I uncovered in my research back in 2005 and how it is now front and center today, even with the information I just gave you. The information I just gave you is nothing more than a continuation of what I exposed way back in 2005 in a book I wrote called Are You Ready? We're going to get into all of this and more. You're listening to the Paul McGUIRE Report. I'm Paul McGUIRE. Visit paulmcguire.us. If you believe in what we're doing, if you understand that what we're doing is making a difference, because, by the way, the reason the people in the alternative media finally were able to get the enlightenment and understanding that they finally got is because there were a handful of people, such as myself and a handful of others, who were deliberately seeding the truth of these matters and many other matters. We were seeding it into the American culture via social media, radio, television, alternative media. We were attacked. We were vilified, much worse. They did everything they could to stop us and censor us, but we kept at it, and the result was these seeds of truth and understanding found their ways into the hearts of many people in alternative media, social media, et cetera, et cetera. And so when you see this new group of people moving forward, we need to appreciate what they're doing, because what they're doing is helping. But also, you've got to raise the bar. You've got to raise the standard. You can't just have shallow understanding. You've got to take a far deeper dive, which is what we've been providing for many, many years, back to 2005 and long before that. God bless you. This is Paul McGUIRE. Visit paulmcguire.us. We will be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Paul McGUIRE Report. This is Paul McGUIRE. Okay, so what we've been talking about, this connection between shutting down the oil sales to Russia, Iran, Communist China from Venezuela, has a further action of shutting down the financing of all kinds of threats to the destruction of America, including financing of Hezbollah-style terrorist cells and more. I mean, this thing is this is just the tip of the iceberg. This is a serious attack against the United States of America, a serious threat. And it has not been, it's been covered up by politicians because it's inconvenient information, because it means they do something. You know, think about this, we have politicians in our nation, in both political parties, by the way, that they're so corrupt, they're so on the take. No, I'm serious. They are literally willing to jeopardize your child or spouses or grandchildren's, the entire future of your children and grandchildren. And by that I mean, for the sake of hidden payoffs, for the sake of monies they're getting under the table, they're willing to turn a blind eye to all kinds of terrorist threats, sex trafficking threats, drug trafficking threats. We have a conspicuous number of totally sold out politicians that are willing to take all kinds of bribes and look the other way regarding all kinds of the most serious threats that could cause mass upheaval in America. It could cause the killing or death of your children, grandchildren, spouse. It could crash our economy. This is not trivial stuff. And we have a serious number. Nobody knows how many there are. I'm sure there are people who know how many there are. We don't. There's a serious number of these politicians that have been totally compromised. I mean, think about it. They're taking money, and the agreement is you won't investigate us. You will back off us. You won't do anything to stop us, or there will be requests by these groups that are paying these politicians off. They're requested to do all kinds of things, to take all kinds of action, to take all kinds of legislation and promote it if it will help the terrorist organizations or the drug cartels or the enemies of the United States gain more and more a superior edge so they can destroy us. So these politicians, even though they live in America and their children and grandchildren live in America, they are so bloody greedy. Their lust for power and wealth and God knows what else is so insane that they will sell their souls literally and sell out America knowing, I mean, they're insane with greed. They will sell out America to such a degree that it literally threatens the lives of their own children, grandchildren, spouse, themselves. I mean, how do you explain people taking bribes, taking payoffs from terrorists and other things that is so egregious, and the potential victims of what you're taking a bribe to ignore, the potential victims are your own family members, the people you know. Never mind having even the most remotest loyalty to the United States of America. Can you fathom that? I really can't fathom it. I mean, I can intellectually assess it, but I can't wrap my head around how you get to the place where you're so insanely filled with greed that you would literally turn the other way and allow things to come in the United States. Maybe products or services, maybe certain chemicals. You can figure that what I'm trying to tell you about. You would help empower stuff that is bringing, right now as we talk, death and destruction to the United States of America. Think of all the politicians on the take and city officials, government officials on the take, and they're allowing just things like this, the sale of fentanyl, heroin, other drugs, sex trafficking, destroying the lives of young children, destroying the death rate from fentanyl, and the drug trade is astronomical in the United States, killing one young person after another young person. And why is it so I can't even pronounce it. Why is it spreading so much? Why is it spreading so much? Because there are big-time politicians, officials, government officials, God knows what positions they're in, that are looking the other way. There are banks that know that what they have on deposit, but it makes them look good to their stockholders. There are banks that have hundreds of millions of dollars in drug money deposits. Yeah. And somebody in that bank or banks knows, but they look the other way. Think about how corrupt you have to become to end up doing that. And so once, the Bible, I'm not going to get into the Bible. I mean, I do all the time, but I'm trying to give you some information. But I would be remiss if I didn't interject a biblical truth. The Bible talks about that when you continue to commit egregious sins, sins that are causing the death and destruction of other people, egregious sins, when you continue to do that, how do you do it? Like people who are taking bribes, and it means selling little girls and little babies in sex trafficking, or killing untold millions of young people through drug trade, or wiping out entire cities if a terrorist attack is unleashed because you turned the other way, or you allowed it to happen as a city official, government official, or whatever. Think, how do you end up in the place where that you can even exist in your mind and heart knowing that you've done that? How can you sit there with your multiple mansions, your high-end cars, your yachts, all the material payoffs that you're getting? How can you continue to do that knowing what you've done? I don't understand. Well, the Bible talks about a reprobate mind, that when you continually, habitually give yourself over to these abominations, that you form a hardness of heart in your heart and mind that's so intense in terms of giving yourself over to a reprobate mind, that the Bible says that there comes a point in a human being when they give themselves over to a reprobate mind so often that they cross the line and they can no longer feel guilt. They can no longer feel remorse or sorrow about what they've done. And it gets so bad, according to the biblical definition of a reprobate mind, it warps the inner part of a human being so badly. According to the Bible, this is what explains how people can be responsible for selling little children, and yes, little babies, in sex trafficking, do unspeakable things to them, and continue to live the high life as if nothing happened, or endanger your nation through promotion of terrorism or drug sales. You see, because you and I couldn't do that. We would go insane with guilt. I'm not promoting suicide. The blood of Jesus Christ would forgive you of all sin if you confess your sin. But, you and I would literally become suicidal. We could not live with that level of guilt. But it doesn't seem to affect these people. Now, I don't totally understand. I mean, I can intellectually understand it, but I don't understand it as a person. I guess you become a non-person. I guess that's what happens. I guess truly the end game in a reprobate mind is you become a non-person. And as a non-person, you're no longer capable of having authentic human feelings like guilt, remorse for what horrors you have done and are continuing to do. I mean, how else could Epstein do what he did, his wife do what she did, and all their regular customers? Okay, how else could they do that? Okay, so what we have here, I want to read something from my book, Are You Ready? Because you will find that this plot to take down America, and we've explained why everybody wants to take down America, why this plot to take down America is connected to South America, it's connected to the globalist elite, and we're going to blow it open for you. It's going to take more than one program to do that, but we're going to do it. You're listening to the Paul McGUIRE Report. We'll be back in just a second. And by the way, if you believe in what we're doing, then show up in the battle, show up in tangible ways, and after you've consulted the Lord, give a donation or a contribution. And you can do it online, securely, and safely. You can do it electronically. If you prefer, you can write out a check. We have the address of the ministry and who you make it out to, or you can do it electronically. You can make a donation or contribution electronically. It takes seconds. All I'm asking you to do is to obey the Lord and understand that you're free. Somebody is paying the price for you to have freedom. Somebody's paying the price for me to have freedom. So let's show up where we need to show up, and that includes myself. God bless you. This is Paul McGUIRE. We'll be back in just a minute. Once again, you're listening to the Paul McGUIRE Report. Okay, so I have all kinds of stuff, data, and content in my book, Are You Ready?, which you can get at paulmcguire.us, by the way. And so this came out in 2005. So I was talking about and exposing this stuff. I talk about the danger and acceleration of child pornography in Are You Ready? And I talk about the true origins of terrorism and all kinds of stuff that people thought I was crazy or exaggerating or making it up. So I have a chapter 8 in Are You Ready? Terrorists coming through the border from Mexico. That's just part of it, but I wrote about it in the book. And so in the book, I talk about terrorist cells that are pouring through Mexico. And where did these terrorist cells come before they came to Mexico? Well, I have another chapter entitled The Dangerous Triangle. And I got this information from Israeli General Shimon Aram, who was a frequent guest on my radio show. And the general warned that Al-Qaeda and other militant Islamic groups were gathering and organizing in what is called the Dangerous Triangle. And the Dangerous Triangle, geographically, is where Argentina, Paraguay, Brazil intersect. Now, before I continue, and I write about it in my book, for crying out loud, these people, and most of the people you know, didn't even know about the terrorist threat organizing in South America until 2 or 3 years ago. Okay? So the point is, I disclose in my book that there is the funding and organizing of terrorist cells like Hamas, Hezbollah, the Islamic Jihad, and the fact that back in 2005, 6 million Muslims lived in South American countries. And they live in countries which are actively recruiting and training terrorists. And this would include, as I say in my book, the ungoverned areas of Suriname, Guyana, Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, Brazil. And I just want to throw this in. When I talk about the Dirty Triangle and some of these other nations, wake up and smell the coffee. Notice that many of these nations were the prime nations that the Nazi elite, the Nazi soldiers, the Nazi top generals, they were smuggled out of Nazi Germany, and some say they were sent by U-boat or submarine from Europe to South America. And so some say Hitler survived World War II. I'm not here to make a final comment about that, but that's what it is alleged. And so the Nazi hierarchy definitely moved from Nazi Germany to South America, and they set up entire villages and schools, and it's like a secret renaissance and rebirth of some of the Nazi European ideologies. And they made babies, and they took control, and they created businesses. So I don't know what the total connection is, but there's some kind of hidden connection between the Nazis and what's going on in South America. Okay. So this area is also known as the tri-border area. Okay? And I go into a huge amount of detail about this. And the only reason I'm telling you this is that this phenomena, this threat didn't happen last night. Okay, so you and I have a job to do. We're going to continue to talk on today's program about threats that are flashing red lights that are at a crisis level. I'm doing everything I can to reboot the ministry we have been hammered. And I'm not here to take out my violin and complain. But we've been hammered by censorship bots and all kinds of weird algorithm and other kinds of weird warfare that's designed to suppress you and confine your voice. Okay, so what? That is not going to stop me. It didn't stop me in the past, and it's not going to stop me now. But the way I can accelerate the momentum, and by momentum, I'm telling you, I know in my heart that it's possible to ignite a biblical great awakening quickly. It doesn't have to be a year out, 2 years out. I believe it's started already. But what needs to occur is people need to be trained in the Bible so they understand what is a great awakening. So when it comes upon them, they'll know what hit them. And in addition to that, people need to know that we are in serious danger in America and not to fall into this narcolepsy sleep state. Okay, so we're going to continue on this and much more. Bernstein. That's not Bernstein. What's wrong with me? It's Epstein. Epstein. And again, I apologize for laughing, but every time I turn around, this maggot of a human being, and that's being kind, the maggot and his maggot wife. Remember I was talking to you about the Zorro Ranch that he and his maggot wife secretly bought? Over 8,000 acres, at least what you can see from the sky. It's 8,000 acres, and it's supposed to be this ranch for children. Oh, yeah, you might. I don't know you didn't fall for that. I didn't fall for it either. I've seen the satellite pictures of, you can see it too, just look for it on the internet. The Zorro Ranch. And that pig and his pig wife, I don't usually call people pigs, but there's certain people that classify as pigs. This pig and his pig wife, they had giant underground laboratories, allegedly, under the Zorro Ranch, where they manufactured made-to-order sex slaves, conducted weird DNA genetic experimentation on children, making them into like enhanced sex slaves, and other occultic technological experiments that we'll get into. And you got to brace yourself. You can't say, oh, no, I don't believe it. It doesn't work. Once you're presented with the truth on a factual, logical basis, then you become responsible. And then ask yourself the question, because we're going to ask this question as we continue on. Why did Bill Clinton and his wife Hillary Clinton secretly go to Zorro Ranch? Who would go to Zorro Ranch? Well, you probably guessed some of the answers. Why would somebody go to Zorro Ranch? And by the way, Zorro Ranch, topographically, is not that far from an isolated area where a famous actor mysteriously died relatively recently. A mysterious, very famous actor built his, I don't know what you call it, his mansion. It was in the same remote area. Now, I am not in any way, shape, or form alleging that this other famous actor was in any way, shape, or form guilty or involved in the kind of stuff that Epstein was. I'm not suggesting that at all. But there is some kind of connection. I'm not saying the guy was a connection in terms of a participant. There's something that maybe this actor knew. I don't even know. I can speculate wildly. Was there a reason for his short-term mysterious death and certain discoveries of things going on at Zorro Ranch? I don't know. But just looking at it from an aerial point of view, it's interesting that there's a geographic closeness from an aerial point of view between the Zorro Ranch and this famous actor's very remote mansion area that he lived in. Did he see something that he wasn't supposed to see? I don't know. But there's something there. This is on the Paul McGUIRE Report. Stay with us. Okay, you're listening to the Paul McGUIRE Report. This is Paul McGUIRE. So, the famous actor, Gene Hackman, really a superstar of an actor who appeared in many excellent films. The two most memorable films I can think starring Gene Hackman, he starred in so many, was Runaway Jury, about the rigging of a jury. I think it was in Louisiana. Dustin Hoffman also starred in that film. And then, years earlier, he starred in one of the most high-powered action police dramas ever directed, The French Connection. Wow. The French Connection 2. Wow. But the problem is, despite how good The French Connection 1 and 2 were, starring Gene Hackman, he basically made those films. Despite the overwhelming box office success and critically acclaimed success of The French Connection, I remember years ago, because this film, The French Connection, was made a long time ago. So after I saw it, many years had passed, and we went to see it. I saw it with my wife. We rented a video of some kind. And The French Connection 1 and 2, it did not hold up. And you know what I'm talking about. Sometimes really good films You see them 10, 20 years after they were made, or 15 years after they were made, or whatever, and they don't hold up. They drag. You're restless. They're boring. And the main reason for that, I believe, is this, that with every passing year in America and the entire world, there is this pervasive acceleration, pervasive momentum increase. And this especially shows up in media and shows up in feature films. So the audiences, such as myself, such as you, if you saw the first French Connection, and even French Connection 2, we would tolerate a certain amount of waiting before the next scene came, or the next high impact scene would come. In a sense, our attention span, our expectation of some kind of emotional payoff, we were willing to wait, and it wasn't waiting for us. We enjoyed the difference in resonance, if you will, of different scenes in the film. But what happens, as I just referred to, as time goes by, because of the acceleration in the external society, now waiting becomes extremely unpleasant, because you have been psychologically trained. And I'm not so sure it's intentional. It's just a byproduct of an acceleration in society. So you're trained to look at a film through new eyes as time goes on, and you expect an emotional payoff. You expect catharsis. You expect action. You expect adventure. You expect romance, and all the rest of this stuff to come on the screen at a faster rate. And now, if you compare the movies of today with the movies of, 30 years ago, it's almost as if, in comparison, the movies of today are being seen and viewed by you and I at almost a stroboscopic, like strobe light, that pulsing light. The pulsing light can be so intense that it can actually trigger your nervous system to have an epileptic fit. That's what stroboscopic imagery can do. So films now move forward at kind of like a stroboscopic speed. Now, having said that, back to Gene Hackman. So Gene Hackman wanted to get away from the madness of Hollywood. Just like in earlier generations, probably a lot of people don't even know who I'm talking about. Some of you will know who I'm talking about. Paul Newman. In his era, he was a superstar. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, of probably his biggest film, that also starred Robert Redford. So Paul Newman didn't like he didn't like the Hollywood lifestyle. A number of actors don't like it. And so he moved with his wife to a very nice area in Oregon. Now, I think they're both deceased now, I'm not sure. But the thing is, notice that he was able to be married to his same wife all those years. And I can't help but observe that probably the reason he succeeded in being married to one woman was because he got out of the Hollywood lifestyle for Oregon. Now, I think Gene Hackman did a similar thing. He was just doing film after film, many of them monster hits, but he picked up and he moved to a remote location, and his mansion, and it's a non-traditional mansion. It blends in with the forestry, and I believe it's in the state of New Mexico or Arizona, I can't remember which, at the moment. So he had a very reclusive lifestyle. He wanted to get away from the craziness. But, and again, I apologize, whether it was Arizona or New Mexico, I think it's New Mexico that we're really talking about. The Zorro Ranch, when you do like a Google Earth search for the Zorro Ranch, and you look down from an aerial point of view, and you slide across the mileage of the rustic area, you will see that Gene Hackman's mansion embedded in the mountains is relatively speaking, close to the Zorro Ranch. Now, when I say relatively speaking, it's a good distance away, but when you're in that remote of an area, that rustic of an area, any large structure, even relatively near another structure, is considered somewhat near. Near enough to be somewhat near in the proximity of, but not near enough to suggest that there was any interaction between Hackman and Epstein and his notorious Zorro Ranch. So we don't know what really happened, because if you blow the whistle and you happen to be a relative neighbor to Epstein's Zorro Ranch, even though you're still far away, And if you were to go around mouthing publicly your concerns regarding what was going on there, and he very easily, through construction workers, law enforcement, and all kinds of people, he could have easily picked up all kinds of rumors, speculations, and even details about what went on at the Zorro Ranch. Remember, Bill and Hillary Clinton visited the Zorro Ranch. They ditched their Secret Service protectors and paid a visit. I think it was a pre-scheduled visit to Epstein's Zorro Ranch, where allegedly in the underground, and when you look at Zorro Ranch, it's really a repugnant looking place. It looks almost like a movie set of some place. It doesn't look like children really played there. The cover story was that it was built to help disadvantaged children, but it doesn't feel like a place that helps disadvantaged children. From the aerial point of view, there's an eeriness about it. So what has been alleged by a number of people was that but directly underneath the facilities of Zorro Ranch that were above ground, and the Zorro Ranch is about 8,000 square feet, the structure you see above ground, but underneath the Zorro Ranch is an underground Zorro Ranch, so to speak, a giant underground facility that may be larger, or it may be the same 8,000 square feet, but it could be considerably larger. And so the underground of Zorro Ranch, and in secret areas in the above ground Zorro Ranch, you have these allegations of DNA genetic experiments on young girls, young boys. They were trying to use their DNA, artificial synthetic DNA from other people. They were trying to breed some kind of different person. It could have been the DNA from famous people. It could have been the DNA they wanted to build the ultimate sex slave. I mean, it's disgusting, but that's what they were about. And other things. Now, also, and I don't even like saying this, but I have to say it or it makes no sense. The allegations were that what went on in many of Epstein's facilities, including Zorro Ranch, was the abduction of young children, boys and girls, to be sex slaves, and that meant to be tortured. Allegations of murder in these ritualistic tortures, the drinking of blood, allegedly, in terms of wanting to perform an occult ritual and to get the adrenochrome from the blood. And the adrenochrome is a chemical byproduct of blood. So this is horrible, and I'm just should I say it? I'm going to say it. Okay, so this is like if a child is being tortured or a child is being killed, the child's body will pump all these super hormones into their bloodstream, like high loads of adrenaline and other chemicals, because the child is going into like a supersonic fight or flight modality. There are certain people who very much understand this, and the reason they drink blood, these vampire allegations that go way back to Europe and stuff, they're not just, they were not fairy tales made up of nothing. There's a disturbing occultic truth to these vampire legends. So in America and among the elite around the world, some of them, a percentage of them, drink the blood of these children, and it gives them a high mentally, and it makes them feel stronger, et cetera, because the blood is now laced with all kinds of survival hormones and chemicals produced by the body under super stress and torture or whatever. Okay, it was difficult for me to even mouth that. It's just beyond my ability to understand. I mean, I don't want to understand it. So there was to put it bluntly, there were a lot of dirty deeds going on underneath the Zorro Ranch, allegedly. And I have to say allegedly, you know why. Okay, so there are just somehow, and I don't think, and I could be naive and I could be wrong, I don't think that Gene Hackman was into this stuff at all. In fact, I would suspect he was diametrically opposed to it. And that is perhaps allegedly why he may have died and his wife may have died, because it was a mysterious death. I mean, I've heard the official story. It's just weird. He mysteriously dies. His wife mysteriously dies in their mansion-like home up in the rustic mountain area. And when you read the account, it just doesn't ring true. It rings true like a cover story. that in reality he was taken out because perhaps he represented a threat. Perhaps he was going to blow the whistle on Zorro Ranch. I don't know. But see, these are the dark things that are traveling in our society, that our society at the very top level is complicit and facilitating and empowering. To say, oh, okay, child sex trafficking, and we're talking about little infants. And, years ago I had trouble when I heard that. I had trouble. Who would possibly molest a little infant? But then when I was teaching at the King's College and Seminary, where I was a professor of eschatology, I also taught other courses. One course that I taught was a course on emotional healing from a biblical standpoint and ministering through the power of the Holy Spirit. And I would pray for people in the class on emotional healing at the seminary. I'd pray for their healing, that the Spirit of God would set them free. And people would open up in the classroom, or they'd come up to me privately and unburden trauma that happened in their lives that was staggering. And after talking and hearing the first-hand accounts of many people of what they went through in terms of being sexually molested as little boys and little girls, you start to frame a more realistic picture of what's happening. And I remember one girl who I respected. I believe she was a nurse in her profession, so she was very sober-minded. She wasn't given to telling fanciful tales or anything. And she came up to me after the class and she shared a personal story. And she said to me, Paul, this I still remember to this day as an adult being molested by a man when I was a little baby and a little infant. And you wonder, how is that possible? And then I'm not going to go into the specific details, but she said, I was left alone in a room where there was a baby crib. And she says, I still remember this as an adult, but this happened to me when I was a little baby infant lying in the crib in diapers. Okay, you got it? It's disgusting. So if you got a kid listening, change the channel for like a couple of minutes and then you can come back. So what happened was the adult male committed an unlawful and disgusting sex act on this little baby, who I was now talking to as a woman, and this happened many years ago. And she said to me, the sex act that he unlawfully did caused me so much pain physically, caused me enormous pain. And I'll never forget the horrific pain and the sense that even as a little baby, I wasn't taught anything yet, but even as a little baby, I had this intuitive sense that somehow something very evil, something very wrong had happened to me. And that I was violated in a very brutal sense. And as being a baby, an infant, she couldn't process it all. All she could remember was experiencing unbelievable pain. And it took her years to be delivered from it. And, I prayed for her, and God continues to deliver her. But, prior to hearing the firsthand testimonies from credible witnesses of exactly what goes on in some of these things, like MKUltra and infant molestation and stuff, I might have been reluctant to believe in this stuff. I might have thought it was exaggerated or made up. But when you talk to people that went through these horrors firsthand, you recognize that there is a deep underground cesspool of sick and psychotic and, yes, satanic people in our society. Because a lot of this, not all of it, but a lot of it goes hand in hand with satanic rituals. Okay, we're going to explore more indicators, if you will, of where we are as a nation and where America is in relationship to the rest of the world. You are listening to the Paul McGUIRE Report. I'm Paul McGUIRE. Visit paulmcguire.us. You can safely and securely electronically donate by going to paulmcguire.us. You just visit the store page and you can donate instantaneously. And if God puts something in your heart, then give and help us stand together and accomplish the goal and the mission that God has called us to. The website where you can donate safely electronically is paulmcguire.us. That's all lowercase, and that's PAULMCGUIRE.US. That's paulmcguire.us. We'll be back in just a moment. Once again, you are listening to the Paul McGUIRE Report. This is Paul McGUIRE. I was doing research for today's program, and you know how YouTube or whatever will send you videos. So I got sent a video on the palatial apartment that John Lennon and Yoko Ono lived in, directly looking over Manhattan, and specifically directly looking over the Central Park area. And the name of these apartments, the apartments that John Lennon lived in, were historically famous apartments known as the Dakota Towers or the Dakotas. And it's done, well, by today's standards, the architecture is it's almost castle-like, but it's a gigantic two-towered structure that has a rich history. And very, very famous people have lived there over the decades. I mean, you know, Tchaikovsky, famous actors and actresses, movers and shakers. They're just huge people, and they're the people that manage the Dakotas are very. I mean, not anybody. You know, it's not just if you have a lot of money can you move into the Dakotas. You have to be pre-screened, and if they feel you're going to bring in a party crowd or a drug crowd or bring in the public sightseers, if they feel you're going to create a problem for them in terms of, you know, like they rejected Madonna, and they reject a lot of people like that. Madonna's filthy rich, Madonna's famous, but they don't want the social media circus and media circus that Madonna brings everywhere she goes. So she couldn't get in there despite her money. Famous politicians, musicians, again, movers and shakers have moved in there through the years, but money alone, at first when John Lennon and Yoko Ono applied, they got rejected because they thought there would be like the fanaticism of the Beatles invading the sanctuary-like atmosphere of the Dakotas. And so Lennon and Yoko had to prove to the management staff of the Dakotas that they weren't interested in parties, they weren't interested in creating a big social ruckus, that they wanted to be left alone. So why I'm bringing this up is for a number of reasons. Number two, the feature film, the horror feature film, Rosemary's Baby, originally the interior was going to be used in Rosemary's Baby, but that would have violated their privacy and like peace and quiet rules. So Roman Polanski, the director of Rosemary's Baby, he used the Dakota building for the exterior, the ominous exterior of the Dakota buildings for the exterior of Rosemary's Baby. And he shot the interior of Rosemary's Baby in another idyllic, historically famous building near Central Park. And Rosemary's Baby the whole thing is about a secret satanic family that lives in there. So that's just a side note. Now, back to Lennon and his wife. So it wasn't all that long ago, if you caught the New Year's Eve celebration in Times Square, New York, where they dropped the ball and all, you know, huge numbers of people in Times Square, huge numbers of people around the world join in singing what I call John Lennon's famous anthem to the New World Order. That's not its real name, the name of the song, because he sings in his song Imagine, you know, lyrics like imagine there's no heaven, you know, imagine there's no nations or countries, imagine there's no more money. And it's this, if you analyze the lyrics that are all the people are singing, and I don't believe, by the way, that John Lennon personally wrote that song. I believe that John Lennon and the Beatles benefited regularly from an invisible hand. And that invisible hand was a famous Fabian socialist thinker, philosopher who ended up working in tandem with high-level British intelligence think tanks. And he had a handler, if you will, that actually created the lyrics, because they were using the entire counterculture and the Beatles as a gigantic social propaganda mechanism to transform American society out of being a capitalist, Judeo-Christian society into being like a tribalistic, New Age, occultic, humanist society. And they used transformational vehicles like the Beatles and other rock and roll groups at that time, and they still use them today. Because the lyrics are too precise for Lennon. I was a fan of John Lennon when I was a kid. And John Lennon, when he sings his own songs, they're more free-flowing. They're more spontaneous. They're more passionate. And they're not, see, some of the best songs by the Beatles and John Lennon, you could say were overproduced by somebody who had a meticulous nature. I don't think John Lennon had a meticulous nature. And the lyrics were overtly political, geopolitical, and philosophical in terms of economic system and social order and the specified plans of the New World Order. They were all laid out in John Lennon's song, Imagine, with great precision, great skill, and great care. So when you hear people singing those lyrics from Imagine, every one of those lyrics could be lifted out of Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto. Every one of those lyrics could have been created by intelligence agency / using a socialist platform to recreate the American nation. And so when you have millions of people singing the lyrics of that song in Times Square and around the world, what they're doing is they're brainwashing themselves, because when you sing that song over and over again in many venues, when you sing that song every Times Square every New Year's Eve on a global level, you're adhering to the primary laws of brainwashing, which are things like repetition, repetition, repetition. When you mouth the lyrics, when you sing the lyrics, that provides one powerful level of programming. When you hear yourself singing the lyrics, that provides another powerful level of programming. And should you read the lyrics somewhere, that's an additional powerful level of learning. All of this combines into self-programming. So what the real writers of Imagine had concocted to do is they came up with a scheme where people would normalize the precepts being sung about in the song. Imagine there's no heaven. Imagine there's no more wars. Imagine there's no more money. Now, why I'm bringing up John Lennon's home, the Dakotas, is simply because of this. Oh, I was thinking of the Tavistock Institute. So some of the key Fabian socialists that migrated over to the Fabian socialist philosophers who created and invented the original critical theory. These were Marxist professors, and this one particular Marxist professor migrated his way over to the intelligence agency / Tavistock Institute. The Tavistock Institute was the world's most premier mind control institute, a research center and secretly a user of mind control technology. And the famous mind control facility was in London, as many of these facilities are. And it was famous for its indoctrination, scientific advances in indoctrination technology. So I believe that they were the invisible hands that caused Lennon to write many of his songs, the Beatles, many of their songs. And by the way, the Tavistock Institute, and one professor in particular, he was the one who personally bought the rights to John Lennon's music, and he bought the rights to the Beatles' music, which was a massive investment. But what does that show you? It shows you that his relationship to the Beatles, his relationship to John Lennon, was not merely a casual relationship. It was not merely a casual business artistic relationship. He was indeed, just go back to this guy's lineage. He has all the attributes of the mind control handlers produced by the Tavistock Institute. And so his buying of the rights of all the Beatles' music and John Lennon's music is simply further evidence of this, in my opinion. So you look at John Lennon, and he lived, when he was writing Imagine, when he was telling the world, imagine there's no heaven, he was very spiritual with his wife, Yoko Ono, inside the palatial space of the Dakota Towers, where he had, when you do the research, you find out not only did he have one palatial apartment, he had approximately 4 other palatial apartments, making a total of about 5 palatial apartments. And then he owned palatial apartments that he used for, and that he and Yoko used for production. One was a production studio palatial apartment. One was the global offices for Yoko Ono's various projects palatial apartment. And one was another palatial apartment that functioned as a coordination center for the John Lennon's global activities. So these, and I believe they in that mix was several apartments that had this magnificent view looking over Central Park, and one, I believe, judging by the photographs I looked at, one palatial apartment, I believe, was situated in a kind of penthouse apartment on the top floor of the Dakotas. And Dakotas had high security in the interior, by the way. So anyway, if you add up all the monetary value of all these apartments in the Dakota, it would be many millions of dollars back then when he began to move in. And today it would be worth a massive fortune in money in order to get those apartments in the Dakota buildings. So while he's singing to the world, imagine there's no heaven, he's tucked out in the Dakota building apartment with his wife, Yoko Ono. And from various accounts, he's a practitioner of occult books and occult reading materials. I believe he was a big disciple of Edgar Cayce as one of his, and she was a huge, I don't know to what degree John Lennon was into it, but Yoko Ono to a large degree was heavily into astrology. So while he's telling the world, imagine there's no religion, he's practicing his own form of religion quite boldly in his palatial apartment. And then he sings songs like, imagine there's no, money. And, we'll all share the wealth kind of thing. Okay, so at the exact time that John Lennon is singing in his song Imagine there's no more money, and he's advocating wealth redistribution, notice that at that time, he personally was worth upwards of $500 million. He had upwards of $500 million in the bank in the monetary value that existed back then when he wrote Imagine. If in comparison, to show you the amount of wealth he would have had, the actual value of his wealth back then when he sang Imagine, in today's money value, $500 million and the real estate holdings would have been worth billions and billions of dollars. So it's fair to say that while he had billions of dollars in today's money, he is singing, and through his songs, he's continuing to lecture the world about imagine, that there's no more money and that we, share the wealth and stuff like that. But notice that he himself didn't practice what he preached at all. And he gets a free pass, by the way. If it's a Christian evangelist, and I'm not defending every evangelist who's misappropriating the funds by any means, but if a Christian evangelist merely dips his toe in affluence, he gets crucified by the media, whereas John Lennon got a free pass. And we know why, because when you do the bidding of your true masters, you get protected. That's how the game is played. Okay, let's look at some other factors, other flashing red lights about what's happening in America that will influence the world. This is the Paul McGUIRE Report. Once again, you're listening to the Paul McGUIRE Report. This is Paul McGUIRE. We were talking about Gene Hackman, the actor, and his palatial retreat in the mountains, rustic mountains, and that his mansion was, within relative proximity to Epstein's notorious Zorro Ranch, which allegedly has a very large, deep underground laboratory beneath the top level of the structure. There's another supposedly larger structure hidden beneath the above ground structure. And I need to just focus in on something because it ties into this and what we've been talking about. Many of the things that I research, I would say most of the things that I research, when I first hear about them, I must confess to you that many times I'm turned off. I don't believe it's true. I think it's a complete fabrication. I think it's a wild story. And I think somebody made it up. I would say that happens more often than anything. So I am not an easy sell, so to speak. And so when I hear something, certain things that are just ridiculous, I reject, like the flat earth, forget about it. And don't write me and defend the flat earth. I mean, please, really, there is no flat earth. There's other things that, are possibly true, and I don't want to get into a list. I try to prioritize what I have researched. So when I first heard about DUMBs, deep underground military bases, I was very skeptical because the people that were talking about it and supposedly disclosing it, in my opinion, they didn't have much credibility. So I dragged my feet and really didn't do that much research on DUMBs because I thought it was a completely made up hoax. And I've got better things to do than chase, rabbits down the trail. So as time went by, I began to see more video stuff, more pictures, more people comment on DUMBs. And then there are what I would call somewhat natural or organic DUMBs, and maybe that's a misleading title. But for example, in some major cities in America, major cities in Europe and around the world, there are from ancient civilizations, there are massive deep underground structures that in many cases housed civilizations, massive numbers of people. And there are all these underground cities and underground that are huge. Many of them are made through volcanic action or earthquakes or whatever, but nevertheless they exist. And so as I began to see the pictures of all these archaeological monuments and leftovers and videos going into these deep underground caverns that were massive in size and saw the remains of cities or large towns, my skepticism very slowly began to erode. And I began to at least be open to the possibility that some of these whistleblowers allegedly talking about DUMBs, deep underground military bases, that there might be something to it. And then when you look at places in the United States, like there are all kinds, because of New York City has been around for so long, I grew up there, and if you go into the basements of buildings, not that I spent a whole lot of time going into the basements of buildings, but if you do, or if you explore an abandoned building, not that I did that either, but if you do all those things, there are all these doors, there are all these elevators that go down to other floors that are not supposed to be there, that go down to large chambers that are not supposed to be there. And nobody seems to know what these large chambers were built for. Perhaps they were built as relics of underground factories and manufacturing at some time. There's an entire subway system. Talk about a classic example. There are numerous. Okay, most of the subway system can be accounted for. It's either subway cars that are traveling on tracks that are above ground. Most of the subways are traveling tracks that are built into massive tunnels, and they built those tunnels a long time ago, and they had to build those tunnels through like solid rock. And they built those tunnels under the Hudson River, which is a massive river system. So when you're going from Manhattan to Brooklyn or Manhattan to Queens and other places, oftentimes the subway will start to go deeper underground in the subway tunnel. And the next thing you know, you're traveling deep under the Hudson River to your destination. That is a big deal considering the time that they were built in. So if they could build those massive underground structures way back in the times that they built the New York City subway system, well, then it's possible that with today's technology that they can do even more things. Okay, so going back to the subway system, there are a number of subway stations. You saw one in The Matrix, a number of subways, the movie The Matrix. There are a number of subway stations that are closed to the public. They're walled off, but they still exist. There are ways to semi-secretly access these hidden walled up subway stations. There are large chambers connected to these deep underground subway systems that nobody seems to know what they're for, but they're connected to subway trains. But the stations are walled off and nobody knows they exist. And then there's supposed to be, and this is from reliable sources, there's supposed to be entire lines of the subway system. The subway system in Manhattan and New York City is composed of different lines. Identified by numbers or letters. And so you have like the Manhattan line, the Queens line, and all these different lines, where there's supposed to be several lines or a couple of lines of subways with stations that although they've been completely dug out and they have track on them and lighting in them and stuff, they're walled off. They're like hidden. Well, what are they being used for? Or are they being used for anything? So all of this made me realize that due to the fact that there already exists all kinds of mysterious, massive underground structures, that there may be something to the DUMBs story. The same would be true of the massive government sealed off areas that are underground in the Grand Canyon and other remote areas. huge underground facilities. And then, of course, in ancient Israel and in the Middle East, there are huge underground facilities from ancient civilizations. Okay, like Petra, where the Jews hid when they were being attacked. That, you're climbing into the rocks, you're going down from the rocks into deep underground fortified caves. I mean, it's like mind-blowing. Okay, so this talk of deep underground military bases, DUMBs, has been around for a long time. And then what sealed the deal, so to speak, on my willingness to believe in DUMBs as the viable existence of the DUMBs was when I saw the photographs and the videos of the relatively new technologies. They actually were around longer than we were told, but the technology is they're these gigantic drills. These gigantic drills that can dig through the rock, can dig through the earth, and these look like science fiction drills because they're built like several subway cars fused together in a rocket-like shape. And in the front, there's a drill. Sometimes in the front and the back, there's a drill. And the actual drill bit, which rips through the earth or the rock, these mobile drills that look like a combination between rockets and subway cars, they're like self-propelling machines, and they're driven by nuclear power. So these are nuclear-powered drills. They have a pilot in them that like a subway train driver. He controls the drill, or it's done electronically, and it can dig through the earth and it can dig through the rock. And because it's a nuclear-powered drill, it can go for, I don't know how many miles, an amazing amount of miles it can dig through the earth per day. Just amazing. And once you recognize what this mobile rocket-shaped drill can do and its nuclear-powered engine, then you realize that all these rumors, all these alleged tales of deep underground bases and interconnecting tunnels between one city and another. I used to scoff at all that stuff. But I don't scoff anymore, because once you realize what these atomic-powered drills can do, they solve all the problems that come up in your mind which cause you to doubt the validity of deep underground bases, deep cities, and deep interconnecting tunnels all across the United States. You see, again, I was so biased against that because I thought, well, that has to be impossible because we don't have any technology available that could even remotely drill that far, drill through rocks, and drill through the distances necessary to interconnect cities or secret military bases. Once I began to examine the reality of these mobile drills with nuclear-powered engines, it changed my perception. It changed everything. I realized that these were no longer tall tales that I was encouraged to believe, but based on the scientific evidence regarding the existence of available technology that is capable of drilling tunnels and drilling deep underground bases, I realized, you know what, Paul, you need to reframe your entire perception. That means you don't throw your brain out the window, but you need to let your brain process the evidence on a much higher scale. And so what I'm trying to tell you is these things exist. I mean, far more than you and I realize they exist. The challenge before all of us is, and the challenge for me personally is, when you do this kind of research, when you become aware of the possibility of many different things, you are faced with this challenge. You need to be able to spiritually and intelligently navigate yourself through the maze of lies, of deception, of distortions, of exaggerations, so that you can navigate around those things and find out what is really true. Because let's face it, we are all in a period where there's an overload of information. And if we're not careful, when we experience that overload of information, we can go into like the spinning state of cognitive dissonance. The key, again, is to learn how to manage all this information. And by managing it, I mean you have to delete, you have to cut out stuff that isn't true. Or not go down certain pathways. Because if you don't proactively take charge of your own mind and your own spirit, then you're going to be sucked into somebody else's vortex, and that's not what you want. Okay? And that, by the way, is a kind of a strategy that was invented by the Russian communist leader Lenin. And Lenin had a term, a psychological warfare term attributed to Lenin. It was agitprops, agitprops, agitation propaganda. It's short for the term agitation propaganda. And agitation propaganda is one form of psyops or psychological warfare. And what Lenin openly stated, because these people made a science out of how to destroy a nation. And in their own communist Marxist doctrines, they come right out and say that, their goal is to take over the entire earth and put the entire earth and all the peoples of planet Earth under the rule of a communist dictatorship or a Marxist dictatorship. That is their end game. And they give themselves a complete license to do that. That's why they use expressions like by any means necessary. In other words, anything that furthers the communist Marxist revolution is totally allowable, even though it's evil, immoral, and an abomination before God. They condone it, they promote it, because they've given themselves a sort of license to kill, if you will, by saying by any means necessary. So it was Lenin and the scientists in communist Russia who developed these scientific techniques, scientific technologies for mind control and brainwashing. Agitprops was one that Lenin especially used. And what that was all about is you begin to pump into the public mind, the collective public mind. You begin to repeatedly pump into the public mind all kinds of contradictory, confusing information. And now in today's society, you can escalate that methodology because you can use social media, television, radio, podcasting, laptops, cell phones. All these electronic means of communication can become carriers of agitprop propaganda. And so you have what appeared to be diametrically opposed social media people clashing. You have people clashing from the left and right, from Democrats to Republicans clashing. You have chaos in the streets clashing. You have arguments on every level of society. You have total sexual confusion with people questioning their sex. And the whole transgender movement adds to the confusion in a very accelerated manner. So you have a society like America that is under the onslaught, under the direct warfare of agitprops, agitation propaganda. And the goal is, according to Lenin, he came out and said this, I'm paraphrasing, but this is precisely what he said. He said that the goal is to input confusion and chaos and crisis in the people to such a high degree that they literally, and these are my words, they won't know which end is up. And so that's why you are just trying to live your life, and you and everybody around you is exposed to a continual bombardment of societal, moral, and every other kind of confusion. And so the only way that you can conquer that is that you have to learn how to operate, or you have to learn how to run your own mind. That's why we teach so much on the biblical principle of the mind of Christ. When you activate the mind of Christ by faith, first of all, you access the peace of God that passes all understanding and guards your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. Second of all, you learn how to manage and process information that appears to be contradictory. And especially when it's coming at you like fast and furious, you slow it down, you slow yourself down through prayer, through meditating in the Word of God. And no, it's not New Age or the occult to do a certain amount of deep breathing, because deep breathing, if you have high blood pressure, for example, when you slow down and do deep breathing, it'll lower your blood pressure. When you slow down and you do certain intentional breathing, breathing in and breathing out in a slower, deeper manner, your calm state takes over. And so you're biologically accessing a certain amount of biological peace. So when you couple biological peace with spiritual peace, the peace of God that passes all understanding, you are then able, it's only in that state of mind, you are then able to be more than a conqueror in Christ Jesus. So what is the goal here? The goal is to be aware of what's happening, to be able to understand the nature of the battle that we're in, to implement and develop effective strategies so that we are not victims. The goal is not to be a victim. If you find yourself hanging around people who are bonded to the victim mode, you're on the way to manifesting the wrong destiny. And by the way, manifesting the wrong destiny is not a New Age term. It's simply every one of us has been given a life by God. Every one of us faces unique challenges and difficulties and obstacles. But by relying on the power of God, we can overcome those things. That is the purpose of everything that we're doing on the Paul McGUIRE Report. So help us move that message forward on a fast and effective manner by going to paulmcguire.us. Stand with us and remember that the Lord God, Jesus Christ, is King of Kings and Lord of Lords. He has not fallen off his throne. He's still Lord, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And it's not an escapist teaching. It's a biblical teaching. At some point that only the Lord knows, the Lord is going to come back for his people and deliver them from the wrath to come. This is Paul McGUIRE. Visit paulmcguire.us, and may the Lord bless you and keep you in all of your ways.